We want to make people aware of this debate and we want to stimulate discussion. That's what it's all about. Okay, so having outlined the agenda very successfully, we thought it was just a good idea, if you don't know your colleagues around the table, just to give you an opportunity to introduce yourselves. Also, one thing is, as we go through the discussions, each of the discussion sessions will start with a discussion around your table. For some of them, we will ask if somebody on the table can just give us 2 or 3 key points from your discussions. So if you can identify just in that first session somebody who would be willing just to provide 2 or 3 key points back to the rest of the room, that would be really helpful. Yeah, I think that's probably it. Anything else I should be saying? So I should have introduced John Stanford, who's the IPSASB Technical Director.
Hello, everybody. Just to mention that the voting forms that Ian has alluded to, there are basically 4 sides over 2 pages. So make sure you have got that form. That is, as Ian says, very important to us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. So we just take 5 minutes just to introduce each other to colleagues, and then we'll start on the second session.
Very good. So, as promised, I wasn't too long.
No, that was.
But I think
good.
it was,
I think that was,
it
it was appropriate. Yeah. That was good. And I think that's going to be something that we're going to need to have for each of the others, actually. That kind of bit at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you have to kind of set it in the European context, and obviously, if Accountancy Europe hosts, they want to be presented a little bit, so that is where they brought their slides in. So I think, okay, I will do that, but very shortly.
And that deals with all the things.
Yeah.
I think the room's okay, actually.
No, actually, I think the room is very, very good for that. It's not too big, it's not too small. It's exactly in the right size. You should know that Petra.
Yeah, she told me.
Okay.
So that was a good time.
At least for me, and colleagues confirmed that it was the same for them. Yeah. I had breakfast with her yesterday, and she just told me it's kind of a purely private decision. She is 51 now, and she realized that she has not that much kind of time for herself during the last years. So she just wants to kind of get her life, or give her life a new steer a little bit. So, and she's as you know, she's based in Cologne, so she's only over the week. During the week, she's in Brussels, always commuting from Cologne to Brussels and things. So, I think it was 10 years now that she.
Yeah, she said.
So she decided, okay, obviously she has nothing new at the moment, so she just takes off kind of a period of sabbatical, and she wants to do something a little bit on the kind of freelancer basis to contribute to projects, to use her knowledge about the European Union. So I'm sure she'll do fine.
Yeah. No. A feeling of sort of breaking up the party, but anyhow, I'm going to move us on just in terms of into the second session. And really the session 2 is really just to get us into the overall perspective in terms of the strategic objective, and then some of the what will frame our work going forwards supporting that. And I thought it was worthwhile actually just reflecting on what we have at the moment in terms of our strategic objective. This was the one that we adopted back in 2015 as a result of our first full work plan consultation during 2014. And what provoked quite a lot of debate within the IPSASB board at the time was the fact that in terms of this overarching objective, we linked our work to public financial management. There was some question about, well, if we linked our work to public financial management, did that mean that that would be a problem in terms of the board's independence and so on? And I think the view eventually that we came to was no. That strong financial reporting is a key element of public financial management. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And that was why it was important to have that link, to have that context in terms of the board's work. And then we had the 3 bullet points underneath that, which was supposed to actually support that. If you look, though, at what we've been doing more recently, essentially, really our work during the current work plan period, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, has focused around financial reporting standards. And then, nothing very much at the moment in terms of activity, in terms of developing other publications. We actually have quite a big standards program at the moment, certainly if you're keeping up with responding to our outputs. Last year was a very busy year in respect of the standards program. And then this third bullet point of raising awareness of issues and the benefits of their adoption. And we haven't really sort of unpacked that up until this point in terms of what do we actually mean. We certainly have activity in that space, but what do we mean? So then as the board started to debate and discuss, well, what should go into our proposed strategy and work plan for the period 2019 to 2023, the question was, should you move away from that overall strategic objective? Should you move away from that overall outline of what we're doing? Or is that broadly in the right direction? And I think the view that we came to in the end was actually, no, that probably is broadly right, but not sufficiently focused. So what we have in terms of the proposal going forwards in the strategy is a refined version of that original high-level objective. Right, okay, so if I can just break in for a moment and just ask, maybe if a couple of the tables could just share some of the key points that have come out against either of those questions. Patrice, can I pick your table?
Yeah, of course. Well, we had, I would say, interesting discussions. And in fact, everybody agrees with the objectives. On the link, on the need to make the link with the PFM, everybody very much supports that because it's the ultimate objectives and the usefulness also the financial statements which need to be improved. On the 5 themes, there was, I would say, everybody also agreed with the 5 themes, but in terms of prioritization, I would say the first one, which is to develop public sector specific issues, probably came first in the discussions, just to, well, and we know this is the route that that the IPSASB is taking now, but also to ensure more credibility to the standards and, to overcome a bit some of the criticism that were made in the past that it was not public sector specific enough. Of course, IFRS conversion, which will help, when you have to also to view the consolidated view at the end if you prepare whole of government accounts, also to, promote the wider knowledge and consistency of knowledge within one country of accounting, which might be very helpful. And then we talk about the user's needs, and it has very much a strong link with the first comment made on the PFM and the link with the PFM. And here we also shared, I would say, discuss whether, the engagement and the efforts on, preaching the good word on IPSAS is done at the right level, meaning that I would say such roundtables are very much useful, but we mainly talk between auditors and accountants together. And the point is, shouldn't be also some more efforts be done at the more political level, just to make sure that, when you need to convince the ones who take the decisions. And yeah, we were also wondering whether this should not be complementary with what we are doing here, because there are a number of government representatives, but mostly accounting guys, which are already convinced. So the point is how to bring it to the level who can take the decisions. And of course there is a CAC, of course there is a PIC, of course. Well, everything exists, but yeah, it's a suggestions that we are bringing on the table to say how can this be moved forward to maybe accelerate the pace of the changes, because a lot of good things are done, it all goes into the right directions, but it's quite slow, not in setting the standards, but in IPSAS adoption around the world. You know how it is. A number of countries are a lot talking about it, but when it comes to really having it applied in practice, this is another story. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Patrice. And I think if you can hold that last area for discussion later on, when we get into discussion of particularly theme E on a more global basis, but also theme D on a jurisdiction basis, because that's exactly what we're thinking about there. And I would say those are the areas where really at the moment our thinking is most fluid. So I think this conversation, that would be a really good conversation. I'll just say something about prioritisation before I take comments from another table. We did have a debate about prioritisation. You need to call the theme something. They were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 originally, and then we had the debate about actually, is that right? I mean, clearly theme A is front and centre in terms of our work programme at the moment, and I think it always will be. But that was why we moved to A, B, C, D, E, because it didn't have quite that sense of, you're ranking them, because we do see the other themes as important. So that was kind of why. But take more comments.
the public finance and the financial markets, because the financial markets, also governments, are an important player in the financial markets. And as we all know, in the financial markets, you have certain grades of solvency. You also have certain levels of interest you pay, interest rates. And it is not enough. It is not enough to look at the Eurostat, at the EC intentions of the ISAs. Why? Because the ISAs, they don't look at the financial markets. They just look at the sustainability, the financial sustainability of governments, of the, let's say, of the 28 or whatever the number is, or will become, member states, and not the rest of the world, not the financial markets, which are everywhere, all over the world, and in which also other important countries play an important role. So instead of convincing, or just convincing, interested people in claiming that the standards are unique and the standards are very good to use and you can improve your management with the standards, you also, or we also, or the IPSASB board could also emphasize the advantages for countries, for governments, to improve their situation in the capital markets area by improving financial reporting, to see it as a kind of an important user. I think that this is more or less, it's not perfect, but more or less the summary of what our group was thinking.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think you're right about that, and actually, it's interesting actually because we have started just the very early stages of conversations with some of the ratings agencies, and it's actually slightly tricky because they don't operate as a group. You have to talk to them individually. But if you talk to some of them, they'll say, actually, there's a bit of what you would describe as a catch-22 situation, because if they're aware of the information, then they'll say, well, actually, we would like to use it, but it's not used consistently. So therefore, we can't build it into our methodology. And then it goes the other way round, because actually, if they started to use it, then people... But I think they're a very important community, and I know the CAG had a presentation from one of the ratings agencies at its December meeting, and probably the single most jaw-dropping moment came when the guy who was presenting was asked, did it matter to him, the difference between cash and accrual? And he said, no. And I think then we went, right, okay, we have an issue here that we really need to deal with, because they really should be, you know, if you think about IFRS, they're a really important, they're really the driver for IFRS in many respects. So, you know, public sector is different, but it should be really important. So, yeah. So, and again, I think that comes into actually how do we work? What's the advocacy role in the broader community? How do we make that work? Okay, that's good. Are there any other points anybody wants to make at this point in time? Yeah.
Thank you. Beatrice Bowman from Belgium, Federal Corps of the Inspectorate of Belgium. I'm afraid we didn't reach a consensus within
part of
at our table, and I've been asked to voice my concerns about the wording of the strategic, the proposed strategic objective. So let me specify to begin with that I have a double perspective, double background, accounting and auditing on the one side and management on the other side. Mm-hmm. This document is meant to become a communication tool, so we have to be aware of the way it can be welcomed by third parties and by our constituency and stakeholders. We generally speak about mission, vision and strategic objective. Here, when I read the strategic objective and the first part of the strategic objective, strengthening public financial management globally through increasing adoption of accrual-based IPSAS, I have the feeling that it should refer to your vision of your mission. And the current phrasing of the mission is the International Public Standards Sector Accounting Standard Boards serve the public interest by developing high-quality accounting standards and other publication for use of public sector entities around the world in preparation of general-purpose financial reports. Why doesn't the notion of the improvement of public financial management appear there? And putting the debate on public financial improvement of public financial management at this level.
Yeah.
And then in the wording of the strategic objective, you could have a debate which would be linked to your legitimacy and your resources. This is the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think you're right. I think we do need to resolve that. And yeah, I think we need to take that one away. Certainly, I think that has come up in the last time we looked at it. But I think you're right in terms of we need to resolve that going forwards. So thank you for that. One more point, and then I'm going to ask people to fill in the voting forms. Yeah.
David Fitzgerald from CPA Ireland. I found myself on a table of 3, 2 of whom told me they were here as observers, so that reduced me to a table of 1. So what you have is the voice of Africa through Dublin, because they had quite a lot to say. Very quickly, points were made. Number 1, has there been any review of the previous strategy and in terms of the outcomes that were achieved or not? It might have been interesting to have a look at that. Number 2, on theme B, the question of conversions or otherwise with IFRS, it was felt very strongly that as close to IFRS as possible should be the name of the game, but not to ignore other frameworks which are or may come into existence, to watch that. Theme C felt that maybe, which reads users' broader financial reporting needs, maybe there might be a case for considering more than just reporting needs, and maybe there might be a case for considering more than just financial reporting needs. And we just leave that thought with you. D was the one which I suppose had least discussion, but we felt was of most relevance, where it refers to adoption, I think. Yes. And we raised the question, what is meant by adoption, and does adoption mean the same thing to everybody around the table? And we would question whether it does or not. And finally, on E, that this is the advocating the benefits, that maybe the link between PFM and service delivery is not clear. It's clear to accountants and to business, but when communicating with politicians, it might not be as clear as it might be. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think those are excellent points, actually. And, I think if we can capture those and build on those as we go into the discussions on each of the themes, I think particularly that when we get to theme D, that, if you like, what's the difference between adoption and implementation has certainly been, something that is becoming clearer in my mind, but I think it's only through this strategy process that teasing the differences out between perhaps the more general accrual adoption, more general adoption of IPSAS in a jurisdiction, and implementing a specific standard, say on leases or something like that, and how do we support that? I think that becomes, that's something that we need to think about. So, at this point in time, if I can ask you to fill your voting forms in, and just to be clear, we will want to collect those at the end of the day, not after each individual session. So there is actually space for you to fill those in. So keep your form, keep it going during the day, as I said, really the idea behind doing the voting forms at the end of the discussion was really that you may be influenced by something that somebody else has said on the table. So please, but also just give us that agree, disagree, but you can put shades of your view into the discussion box as well. So use that however you want to. Okay, so if you can do that just in the next few minutes, and then we'll break for coffee and come back here for 11:30. So when you've had a chance to use the voting forms, then coffee is available outside.
Just look at the cash flow
Hey, in twee.
Yeah, this was the first question. So But also maybe a bit about this, like, how we're planning to look at measurement, application guidance to measurement. So we'll incorporate them.
Not saying it's a good one. Same thing. Perspective is not education, it's not it's something there's still private portion to it. Therefore, when you look at the total cost, I mean, barely, but cost against everybody else.
And then you also had, and this was one of the big debates in one of the mergers I went through, you used pen or pencil. People were really
Vice versa. The real ghosts
Everybody wants the most money, most of the money for their departments, of course, and so you get certain ideas. It also depends on the kind of politicians who work together. Extremely right cannot work with extremely left. For instance, in Germany, Merkel, the CDU, and the socialists go along, and then it comes to agreement. Not only about their objectives, not only striving for, but also how are we going to finance it, with what kind of money, how many millions are we going to spend for this and that and that and that. Ultimately, the money is spent. But this is a forced system in many democratic countries. Countries like China, for instance, where it is a completely different system because it is a very autocratic, dictatorial, communistic country. Also countries without any kind of money. Because to understand, if I may exaggerate a little bit, because the big chief or the president or the king is taking it privately. Budgetary accounting, and I'm not complaining at all, but don't misunderstand me. But budgetary accounting is much less
Okay, so we now move into the next part of the roundtable event, and here is where we start to think a bit more about some of the projects specifically. So basically my two colleagues here, Sebastian and Mark, are going to do the introductions to the different parts. Basically, there will be three points where we'll have a discussion. The first will be around the criteria that we've used to prioritise projects, and Sebastian's going to give you a bit of background on our thinking on that. And then we'll have a break for some discussion, which we're going to do in plenary rather than by table. And then after we've done that, then Mark will actually give an introduction to the projects, and then there's two areas for discussion there, Theme A and Theme B. So if we leave it to you, Sebastian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ian. So, hello everyone. We now move into the session on the proposed work plan 2019-2023. I would like to start a little bit philosophical. If you think where you would like to go, so 2019-2023, well, you need to know where you actually came from and where you actually stand. So where did we came from? We came from, Ian pointed out this morning, 20 years basically of IFRS transferring to IPSAS. That portion has been finished to a large extent. And now, where do we stand? Well, that's our current work plan, which I have here on the slide. And this work plan is categorized by two major issues. After having applied IFRS in IPSAS, we now move to more public sector specific issues. And that's one topic. What's public sector specific? Well, public sector provides services to the public, and that's different to the private sector because that's not on a exchange basis where fair values on both sides are similar. So we have this non-exchange element of service providing where we are basically dealing with. And the second major topic is, well, IFRS is moving, so we still need to converge with those standards that are new in IFRS and have been introduced. So that characterizes our work plan. That's the work plan basically decided on the last strategy and work paper 2015, and we have moved considerably on this work plan, as you can see, and as I would like to elaborate. So we have the ED on social benefits, and that's purely a public sector specific issue. And one thing you also need to know, also for me as a board member, if you start from basically scratch with a standard, that's involving much more work as compared to, well, you have something where you can start with and you try to apply the public sector specific elements to this standard. So that's social benefits, and we talk about that in the afternoon. And then we have this big topic about revenue and non-exchange expenses and also non-exchange revenue. That's also in there. And that has some IFRS conversion elements because IFRS 15 has been introduced on revenue in the public sector, and we try to think about the consequences for the IPSAS. And also included in there are non-exchange elements, so it's on both sides of the topics here. Then we have another major IFRS project, which is IFRS 9, where we work on financial instruments, and also there we have elements that are public sector specific. And then next down the line is leases, where we have IFRS 16 that we move into IPSAS, and also there are public sector specific elements which are basically, well, you might have leases that are, we call that concessionary, so not at a fair market value, that the leases are priced at fair market value. So with these standards, we are pretty well advanced, being in ED stage or close to an ED. And then we have down the list public sector measurement, heritage, infra. To put new issues on the agenda, to discuss new issues. Well, then I move to, well, in thinking about what we put on our agenda, well, which criteria do we apply in selecting the issues that we would like to? Public sector entities, and that would put them high on the agenda. Next one is consequences, whether the issue impairs the ability of the financial statements to provide useful and transparent information for account. The plenary discussion Ian mentioned about whether you agree with those criteria for selecting topics, whether you come up with other important issues that should also be addressed.
Thanks, Sebastian. I think that's a very good scene setter in terms of where we are at the moment. You referred into the document in terms of our expected progress in terms of projects, and that's certainly been a very important part of our deliberations. And then these criteria, and I think, you know, as Sebastian said, what we want to do is rather than do it as a table discussion, actually just get any immediate thoughts that you as a group actually have on those. You know, do those feel right? You know, have we missed something? You know, it's not a kind of entirely scientific. You can grade it 1 to 4 on each of those and then add the numbers up. But actually, as you'll see, it's not included in this document. But on the website, we have a document that shows how the board has actually evaluated the potential projects, both the ones prioritised, and those not prioritised. You know, using those criteria. So, are there any immediate thoughts anybody has on those? Thomas? Yeah. And then.
Thanks. And now I'm changing hats. I'm speaking obviously as the CAC chair, just to give you a kind of a short insight in the discussion of the CAC regarding these topics. Obviously, the CAC had strategy discussion in June and December 2017, and just focusing on these criteria here, I think the CAC supported the criteria. as well as the kind of description of the criteria. But on the same time, I think there was a warning to find the right balance in using these criteria, because on one side, obviously, kind of urgency and prevalence was seen as being kind of the major guiding criteria in terms of closing gaps of public sector specific literature. But on the other side, I think there was a warning that some of the projects might be quite resource intensive, and there is kind of a risk of creating expectation gaps on one side by starting projects and not being able to deliver on them in due course. I think we have examples in the past. Just thinking about public sector combinations as one issue, or social benefits is another issue. So I think that was in general the discussion. So yes, support for the criteria, but warning to find the right balance.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Patrice, you wanted to?
Yeah. It's not a comment. In fact, it's a question to you, Ian. No, but I would say a number of years ago, and you know it, and the main criticism against IPSAS was that, okay, it's coming from the private sector, so, you know, it's not suited for us, so we reject it without maybe thinking a bit more further. So how do you think it has evolved over the years, and what is your perception now of, you know, this criticism that existed in the past and probably less now, but would like to hear your perception about it.
I think, if you like, perhaps it's a reflection of the fact that things have changed very much over the 20 years since the IPSAS programme actually started. And I think if you think back 20 years, actually there were very few jurisdictions around the world that were actually applying accrual in their financial reporting. And it really was sort of New Zealand, Australia, and that was probably more or less, you know, one or two others, but not very. And I think if you think about it now and you look at, you know, what's going on, just if I look at Europe, what's going on in Africa, what's going on more broadly, there's a lot more experience now about using accrual in government. And so I think actually now people can have that debate and say, actually, truly, is it something that is specific to the public sector, or is it just that historically we've done things in a certain way in the public sector, and there is always a reluctance to change? Now, I think it's not an entirely scientific thing in terms of does this apply in the public sector or does it not? To an extent, there will always be scope for debate, and particularly I think in the area that we're operating in at the moment, where if you go back to that slide that Sebastian just showed us, a lot of it is about what is non-exchange, and that's not a binary thing, because actually it's very much a grey area, and that's why, you know, that's what we're looking at really. If you take the revenue project, you know, if you look at grants and other transfers, is that exchange, is that non-exchange? It's really difficult. You have a lot of different types of arrangement, and so I think it's actually becoming more nuanced now. Originally, the IPSAS programme actually deliberately picked up on those standards, those IFRSs, which essentially you could see more clearly would operate in the public sector as a way of actually, and we got through the first 20 standards quite quickly that way. Now we're actually operating in a space where A, people have more experience, but B, actually we're in that hard area about non-exchange. What is it? How does it work? So I don't think the debate will go away, but I think as more people are using the standards, actually you can have a better debate, which isn't just, I don't like IFRS, I don't want to use it in the public sector. I exaggerate, but in some respects, actually, that's kind of what you get, to actually, does it work in this particular context or not?
Can I just add to that, Ian?
Yeah.
Thanks. I mean, I think if you take some of our recent projects, we've certainly demonstrated an ability to move away from IFRS requirements where we consider there are public sector reasons to do so. So, as an example, Sebastian mentioned the work we're doing on leases. That's got both a public sector specific stream, but it's also got a IFRS convergence strand. It started as an IFRS convergence project, But Sebastian's mentioned the fact that we needed to look at concession releases. They're not addressed in the private sector because they're very much a public sector issue. And also for lessor accounting, we decided that we'd adopt the same approach, or propose in the ED, the same approach as for lessee accounting. And we've certainly moved a long way from the IFRS on that. If you take our conceptual framework and think about measurement, we haven't actually included fair value as it's currently defined by the ISB. Some suggest we should, but we've emphasised public sector specific issues, the service delivery nature of public sector specific issues. So whilst we've certainly acknowledged historical cost, when we've looked at current value, we've very much stressed the importance of replacement cost rather than fair value as the basis for valuing public sector assets. Okay, so thank you.
Yeah, and so I think, if you like, the board has, you know, gained in maturity. I think the standards suite has gained, you know, we're now much more complete and so on. And I think, you know, I think that's going to be, an ongoing debate, and it certainly is a debate within the board as well. We have a process to apply, in terms of assessing IFRS literature, but,
Well, the question, Patrice, regarding IFRS, whether that should be applied in public sector. I think the thinking behind that, IFRS is first from the private sector. Second, it's complicated, and it's burdensome to apply. And we had this discussion in board meetings. Well, if in the public sector, for example, I'm talking about financial instruments, are also applied that are complex, well, why not use those standards that are already out there and that are deal with complicated issues? The world is not that easy. And if you don't make complex contracts, well, you don't have to apply it.
Yeah, actually, that's more or less, that was one of the really clear things from a session with the International Committee in France last year, that somebody said exactly that actually, if you don't do complex things, actually this is an easy standard. It's actually when you do complex things. But again, I think it's actually, and I know I've sat there as a preparer in the Ministry of Finance, actually trying to work out, well, how do I apply this in the context of the types of things I'm facing is tricky. But I think it's the more people have actually done that, the better the debate actually becomes, in terms of, how should we actually report the economic substance of the transactions. IFRS can be a tool, but it's not necessarily the right tool in all circumstances, which is, is what John said. And actually, I think, I feel quite comfortable that we've actually chosen to follow IFRS in certain circumstances, but we're actually having a robust, we've said, no, we don't think that the lessor accounting proposals in IFRS 16 are right for the public sector. Our constituents may say otherwise. Any other thoughts, just going back then to those criteria? Yep.
Thank you. One question and one remark, and both are linked. First, the question. One of the criteria you want to refer to is prevalence, and I can support this criteria, but I have a question regarding the way you will capture the prevalence of a topic. If you look at the composition of the audience today, I don't think there are many representatives of service or departments with outside the accountability or outside the accounting roles. So how would you capture the interests or prevalence of some topics outside this realm? Second, at this moment, the most prevalent themes and topics within the public stakeholders about not that much about accrual accounting and profit and loss and so forth, but about reporting in either terms. Reporting towards the European Commission based on national accounting standards, which are not the same philosophy. So how will you combine both aspects? Thank you.
I mean, I think it comes back to actually using information for public financial management. And, you know, if we look at prevalence at the moment, I think we can very clearly see that there are certain areas that are not covered by our standards suite, which is really, if you look on the current list of projects, social benefits and non-exchange expenses, that are clear gaps in our literature. And indeed, we've rightly been criticised for not having standards in those spaces. I think, you know, then some of this is actually about really what we're doing at the moment, which is actually trying to connect with people who might be potentially interested in using our standards, but also who currently use our standards. And what we need is actually to draw on them, their knowledge, their networks, you know, in terms of nationally, what are the issues that you are dealing with, which are causing problems at the moment. Now, you know, part of this, yes, is as well, what are the links between IPSAS and government finance statistics? And that's where we're trying to maximise the extent to which people can use high quality accrual information, not only for financial reporting, but for in-year management, for government finance statistics, ESA returns, and so on. And yeah, certainly that's one area where, you know, we know where ESA has got guidance, we haven't got guidance, and so on. But ultimately, you know, and I think you can talk about this, for example, in the context of IPSAS, actually what you want is high quality, audited, actual information that reflects the economic substance of transactions, you know, and it's how you deliver that's important. Thomas?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that was a very good question regarding prevalence, because I think not only in the IPSAS but also in the EPSAS context, I think we always have emphasized the need to broaden the discussion beyond the borders of the accountancy profession, because obviously when accountants talk to accountants, I think we tend to agree, mostly, not always, but I think it's not really hard to convince this audience in this room about the need for kind of transparency, accountability and things like that. But in the IPSAS context, I would say that especially regarding prevalence, there is kind of a big responsibility of the consultative advisory group in order to capture these themes and issues which are prevalent and important to the public sector. And we have intensive discussions with the PIC, with the Public Interest Committee, regarding the functional balance of the composition of the CAG. So not only including accountants, not only including preparers, but also including societal organizations and getting the broader views of what is in the public interest. And I think it's really the burden and the responsibility of the CAG to ensure that the board has enough information in this regard.
Yeah, and its composition is very deliberately chosen so that it complements the representation around the board. And you know, part of this is about visibility. You know, we're using the opportunity of having the strategy and work plan to actually do some letter writing to actually groups that we wouldn't normally talk to explicitly say, can we have a conversation with you? So we're not going to solve it overnight, but I think, you know, it's a lot of it is about those various different routes for getting information in. And we, you know, one of the things that is in the strategy is we need to keep looking at it as people, you know, as we have the conversation. So we proposed a mid-period review as well, where we'll have another look and say, well, have we got the right projects at this point in time, bearing in mind the progress we've made with projects, resources and so on. Should we be picking this thing up and dropping that, putting that on hold and that kind of thing? Okay.
I got two things. One is a quick question, and then there's a comment on the list. The question is on the four circles. There is a heart or a square, a sweet spot. Are you gonna deal with the ones inside that sweet spot, or how far out are you guys gonna go? So that's one. And the comment I have is I looked at the list of projects and the list in the appendix, which is obviously the rest of it that you've identified. And I was wondering whether it's complete. Maybe a few things from financial reporting background that one can think of, but I guess the other big point is also around how does that work and how does that link into the budgeting and controlling efforts and needs of governments and entities? Because if I'm a corporate reporting person and a means of background. So I know that in every reasonable organization they look at their budgets and they know how their budgets are, if some tweets going to link into the financial reporting world. But how does that work this way? We are starting here at the top at the outside reporting, but I've not identified in that strategy and in that document the link to the internal budgeting and controlling process. So that's the kind of the thing to comment.
I mean, picking up your first point, yeah, certainly we want topics that ideally hit all of these. You know, overall we do want balance, but we're really looking for projects that hit all of those. Mark's going to talk in a minute about the projects that we've selected. The list in Appendix A is not exhaustive. It's a list that we've arrived at as a result of discussions within the board, discussions with the CAG, discussions with public sector standard setters through a forum that we hold every 15 to 18 months. So, you know, it's that. But certainly, although we're not focusing on it for today, we have actually asked people a question in terms of, is there anything else that you think we should be considering? Just on budgeting, I mean, clearly that's not an area of responsibility or within our remit. It's very much a jurisdiction-specific approach, depending on a lot of jurisdictions still, you know, even if they report on an accrual basis, will budget on a cash basis. That's very common. Sorry?
That does not work.
Well, the debate on accrual budgeting, I would say the debate on accrual budgeting is actually where the debate on accrual reporting was 20 years ago. And, you know, there's kind of like what the frame is for the budget, which is different between jurisdictions as well. So, you know, that debate is very much going on. I think the important thing, though, is that you have more jurisdictions now that are doing it. You know, I look at, for example, Austria, I look at Switzerland, you know, there's a lot more, you know, that debate is active. But it's, you know, whilst we can influence that and say you need information about the economic substance of transactions, you need that at budget, you need to monitor it during the year, and it makes sense to report it all on the same basis. And anybody in the private sector would say, why would you do anything else? But that's not the case in government at the moment. That argument is not made, and that's really one of the things that, you know, we have to influence going forwards.
That's why I'm missing it on the strategy, because
Yeah,
you can't separate.
but that's something that we can't do anything about. We can't directly set standards for budgets. We can set standards for financial reporting, and what we're trying to do is actually make sure that our suite of standards is as complete as possible and it addresses public sector issues. Then there's a debate about people using that for budgeting, and that might well influence us in terms of actually have we provided the right guidance, do we need to review certain topics. But we can participate in that debate, but ultimately we're not the decision maker on that. So
we will have that in promoting IPSAS.
Yeah.
Probably there it will come up again.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, exactly. So at that point in time, if I can ask people if you can just take a couple of minutes to record your thoughts in terms of whether you agree or disagree with the criteria, and comments and thoughts that you've got having listened to the debate, and then Mark will introduce the projects that we are proposing to prioritise under themes A, B and C.
If I may add that,
There was some, yeah. Well, I was just told
Okay, so if we now move on, and Mark, who's another one of our board members, is going to introduce the board's thinking in terms of the projects for prioritisation. So, Mark.
Okay, based on the criteria you just have got from Sebastian, and also the list of possible projects we received from various outreach activities, Ian just mentioned what projects do we propose to add to the work plan 19 to 23. So first of all, in the topic, in the Team A, public sector specific project has always been a priority for the board, given that this is the area of main concern for many preparers and users, and therefore there also were the most gaps where we had to put our projects. And just to say, this will continue to be the case, so the public sector specific projects will remain the biggest area of work for the IPSASB. We have proposed now 4 projects currently, which is the natural resources, discount rates, differential reporting, and limited review of the conceptual framework. Concerning the natural resources, there is currently a lack of guidance in the IPSAS. It is especially relevant for resource-rich countries in the world. Maybe this may not be all too relevant for Europe, but other continents it's a very relevant topic. Just to say, it doesn't just focus on extracting resources like IFRS does address. It has a much broader scope and it includes other natural resources such as water, air, or even living species. There has been some work by some national standard setters we could draw on. So this would be for the criteria of technical resource considerations would be a more favorable thing. And also this also led a little bit influenced that we it's a highly favored project currently. Discount rates are significant in all jurisdictions. They affect the financial statements, but they also affect the balance sheet. And it's the question whether the current principles, do they still reflect the the new interest rate environment we have. So, for example, we have many jurisdictions are now for many years in a negative interest environment, and the question is, do these discount rates or do negative interest rates reflect, for example, the time value of money? So, all in all, it's a very important issue we have also received so far from our stakeholders, but it's also the view of the board. Then differential reporting. There have been, although considerable many jurisdictions on national level have implemented IPSAS directly or indirectly. However, we still hear the concerns from lower levels, entities from lower levels of government, like state level, municipality level, that there is still a hurdle for them to implement IPSAS, and they require a less complex set of standards. Which is why we also added this project to the work plan. It's not clear today in which direction this project will go. We have some work we could draw on. So the most obvious one would be IFRS for SMEs. However, there are also national standard setters like New Zealand who already did some work, who made a different approach, and for example, who said that very small entities still can rely on cash accounting, while the bigger ones have to gradually increase the complexity, more complex accrual statements. And there's also a possibility to reduce the disclosure burden. So these are the directions that could be taken in this project. And then finally, we have a limited review of the conceptual framework. As you know, the conceptual framework was introduced in 2014. Since then, we have developed many standards, IPSAS standards, and while developing the standards, we had questions that referred back to the conceptual framework. The other area is that the ISB is expected to revise their conceptual framework in the first quarter of this year, which literally means tomorrow they announced it, and this could also be a source for this project. Just to say clearly that for all these new projects, we will have really to have a more thorough scoping stage of these projects. So it will be really important if you look at natural resources. It doesn't mean that this must be a wide scope project. It could still be a narrow scope project. We have to look at that, and it's also not clear whether, as you see now, intangible assets or sovereign powers are excluded, but it could be that these issues are somewhat related to the natural resources project, that they could be included. So the scoping will be very important, and of course for these public sector specific projects, the research phase will also likely to be of a longer stay, just to get it right in terms of scope and definitions and what we want actually to cover with the standard. Now I move to the Team B, the IFRS convergence. The IPSASB has already have ongoing work to maintain IFRS convergence. However, a number of IPSAS at this point in time remain based on older versions of IFRS. And given that the ISB in his work plan 2017-21 has just decided to focus on the completion of large-scale projects, there is actually a catch-up opportunity for IPSASB to close these gaps. And it could be possible to have major projects, narrow-scope projects, and minor amendments, improvements. Currently, we only, as the only single major project, we propose the updating of IPSAS 18 segment reporting. As many of you might know, that there are many preparers who prepare IPSAS standards based financial reports have struggled, especially with the segment reporting. In my jurisdiction in Switzerland, it's the same. we have now a project to close almost any of the IPSAS gaps on the federal gaps to IPSAS on the federal level. However, segment reporting remains a problem. We are just not able to use it. It doesn't make sense. And maybe this also goes a little bit in the direction we heard about the relevance for budgeting, the relevance for fiscal policy. So again, here we have possible directions we could take. We could go more into the direction of IPSAS, IFRS 8 segment reporting, but the other way would be to go a completely new route, which would be more in the route of for example, GFS, and making the whole question of segments, how can they be made relevant for fiscal policy purpose and financial management. Okay, then finally, Team C. As you know, the IPSASB has already developed in the past non-mandatory guidance addressing a broader financial reporting needs, which cannot be satisfied through general purpose financial statements, such as the recommended practice guidelines. At this point in time, the IPSASB does not propose to activate a project. However, it wants to prioritize in the Team C the focusing on monitoring the developments in this area. We have various developments. For example, IFRS is starting to review its management commentary guidance, and this may in the future influence our RPG2, financial statement disclosure and analysis. And as we will later discuss in social benefits, we have the current RPG1 about sustainability and the question, should it be made mandatory or not? So to have no project here doesn't mean that the Team C is not important, but it's just also in the terms of timing, we would like to, it's better now to wait the developments so that we can act then when the time is appropriate. Just two other remarks. Prioritizing such a project, as you see in the green, doesn't necessarily mean that this will lead to a new standard. It may also be just that there is a necessity to amend the application guidance or implementation guidance. And it may also be, like in the case of infrastructure project or heritage assets, doesn't necessarily mean to have a new project. And also the pace of the completion of the current projects, as Sebastian has presented to you, will determine when is the starting of this new project. Okay, now we would like to discuss the Team A, setting standards on public sector specific issues. And the question is, do you agree actually with the prioritized projects? As I say, the prioritization also, we had, as Ian mentioned, previous outreach events, public sector standard setting forum, and this also influenced, of course, the selection. There was some informal like voting, but it's now the question: do you agree with that, or those who attended this forum, do you still agree? And if not, are there any alternatives, or as Ian already mentioned, are there any completely new projects we should consider, which are not yet in the list? Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So if, bearing in mind we're running slightly behind time, if we can make the discussion around the tables 15 minutes on this one, and then we'll just take some general comments. So we'll just skip back so that you've got the list of projects up there on the screen. Okay, thanks.
Just sorry, just to clarify, there has been a question about the colors, and the green ones, the 4 green, are those projects we propose. The IPSASB proposes for inclusion, and the question is, do you agree with that? And the red ones are those we currently don't propose to include, which doesn't mean they won't be included at any time. It could still be possible in the future, but it's currently not on the list for active projects. So,
and it
just
has nothing to do with the colors of the criteria on the right.
Ah, okay. Now I understood the question. No, exactly. It has nothing to do with urgency or with prevalence. This is completely different thing. Yeah.
There's a reference in here to heritage. I understand this true heritage, to cultural and social. And there's also reference to infrastructure, but it does not say specifically what is the existing starting balance. If you contribute something to the report, you measure the fair value of the time you contribute. So that's an essential part. What's the starting balance sheet? That's one. And the second one that's completely missing so far as I see is scope of consolidation. What does include scope of consolidation? What's about public-private partnerships? How about private capitals, businesses, may or may not, subsidies or not? And quite frankly, IFRS is not if I want to screw around with my numbers, the first thing I do is understand, well, this subsidiary is a problem, so I can't sell it, so I better find a way to this one's good. What composition of the group is reporting entities? So it's IFRS 10, 11, quite basic. That's
I would actually prioritize
then it comes, it's a pillar. Yes.
variable return concept of IFRS, I think variable return is also negative, by definition. That's it. But it's just not on the list. What the assets are. And what's because consistency of reporting is a requirement. One thing that you start screwing around with is missing some assets here, you're going to have a misstatement. So that's something I have to. These are the two I take a train from Berlin to Munich and explain the guys in Munich that based on the variable returns they are fully consolidated because Bavaria switched to zero tax revenue and all they get is distribution. The municipalities, they have some. The state of Bavaria has zero tax revenue. It is fully consolidated. Money rules at the end of the day. That's every time I hear my friends from Bavaria speak out loud, I'm going like, next week they're discussing the budget. That's the same story at home. We have a few provincial governments that are some of retiring now. They were pretty outspoken. But they always have to come back the next week and say, so two big ones agreed that they had control, but now they're just in place. Private partnership.
Value that defined as if we are going to sell it immediately or
Unlimited water
Okay, so if I can ask you to move on then to theme B for the next 10 minutes, we'll just have a table discussion on theme B, and then we'll come back into the plenary and pick up comments from people on both themes in A and B. Sorry.
That's what we get borderline to the more socialistic that approach. Cost base is something where it's tangible as I do want to comment and say, for instance, processes, applications in an entity, that's very arbitrary, very hard to measure, regular subjected to impairment tests, does not have ownership, that's the old story, soccer player, if you pay 30 million for a guy, you account for it, if you train that guy for 10 years, you can't. At the end of the day, I know we're talking to politicians, that's going to be very hesitant on soft issues. Just excuse me for a second.
So if we say that
Right, in my eyes. Right. That's all.
Why not just one?
That's why I'm saying we're in the scope of consolidation. First, then we should go right into it's related.
Okay, so if we can get some just key points that have come out of various of the tables in terms of thoughts on either theme A or theme B or both, just for the next few minutes, and then we'll ask people to fill in the feedback forms. So I'm not sure we've heard from that table over there. Anybody like to contribute some thoughts from your discussions on projects?
Thank you. So our initial discussion on theme A actually was that it was very difficult to do that without theme B. So it was helpful we combined the two. In terms of theme A, one of the elements that we talked about was actually natural resources and whether that had that public sector specificity that was needed, or was that really something that should sit across in theme B, looking at the experience already from the private sector. Discount rates we talked about, and it was very much viewed that, yes, was very clearly an issue, but I'm going back to our days on the FRAB, where discount rates was on every agenda, and it's still on every agenda, and actually, is it possible to get something through before actually the wider economy probably changes the issue quite significantly? There's a bit of discussion and debate on that point within the table, but also the fact that it was going to be a very long-term project that we were being locked into. Which then led us into a discussion on whether this was all about standard setting or whether it was about guidance, sort of urgent issues being addressed. Could we learn more from international approach to actually how do we respond to urgent issues and develop those? Differential reporting was probably the one that across the table there was less support of. And again, looking very much back at the IFRS approach and the adoption levels there. So yes, we know it's an issue that's been raised a lot, it's viewed as a barrier. Is actually that solution going to really be adopted? So I can see the rationale in terms of responding to comments and criticisms. Those same comments and criticisms are made about IFRS, but actually potential solutions not being adopted. So an issue there in terms of just the prioritisation. And then the limited review of the conceptual framework was was accepted largely. I think in terms of then the link through to IFRS convergence, we then sort of took a step back to say that in terms of the approach for prioritisation, which I do agree with, there is a potential risk that what happens is you end up with some very long-term projects. And then, so you've got the right strategic approach, but actually at a tactical level, you could end up with a board where you're not actually be able to get anything through or out. So is there a need to actually look at what can be presented or areas or issues that could be resolved in a shorter term to keep that throughput? Because again, that gives you the opportunity for those touch points at a political level and that re-engagement. So I think there was a sort of step back to say, well, actually, what does this look like overall in terms of approach? And then in terms of which other ones we would potentially prioritise, so theme A, military assets, came up as a real key one, very much through the public sector specificity on that one, and the fact that that one would have a clear need against perhaps the natural resources and also discount rates, which would not necessarily is key in public sector, but also has a private sector implication. So I think that's an overview. I don't know if I've missed anything from around the table. No?
That's good, thanks. And it does start to get you into that, how do you balance things? And as Mark mentioned, you know, if we have a project, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'd have an IPSAS. So, for example, in terms of the way we're taking measurement forward at the moment, we're kind of trying to make progress on that, and then we'll go back to heritage and infrastructure, because from what we've seen, actually, probably what's required there is application guidance on recognition and measurement. And similarly, I think you could have the same sort of approach on military equipment, which might also allow you to move quicker. So we are going to have to think about things like that, definitely. And discount rates, yes, we're well aware that that would be challenging. But, you know, sort of in the kind of President Kennedy mode, you know, we're not doing it because it's easy. I think it's an area that is huge, whether you look at the impact on performance or the balance sheet, and it's actually not, you know, and ISB's finding this, it's not well treated in the accounting literature at the moment. So, yeah, it's technically would be very challenging, but probably we need to have a look at it sooner rather than later. And you know, the interest rates environment obviously gives you that incentive, but there is a real question about what interest rates do you know, should you use, because the sort of conventional AA corporate bond rate, even when you try and actually find out what a AA corporate bond rate is, and also does that move through time, as you were saying, when you've got very long-term provisions and pension liabilities and so on. So, yeah. Okay, thank you. That table over there, so Jens, your table, if we can sort of get any thoughts from your discussions. Not necessarily from you, but it's
I mean, this issue of I mean, we are here more at a little bit of a German table, besides Simone, but she's more reporting. She told us. So we're looking at a little bit from a German perspective, and with regards to differential reporting, we saw a little bit the situation in Germany where you have these 16 different states, and at the local government level, each state is having its own regulations. And I mean, for those smaller entities, and we were talking about this really village of 500 people, and when you then come with the IPSAS handbook and say, look, please apply, this is clearly not what they will be able to do. And so, and when you also think of Germany, you know, with the 16 different states, and the data from them is not comparable between states, and when there would be a kind of a standards for smaller local governments that could achieve such comparability, I mean, that could maybe be an approach to maybe make the IPSAS more attractive in Germany, probably. So this was one of the issues, and the other issue that we discussed was the discount rates, because I mean, really a small change in the discount rate has a huge effect on your kind of pension liabilities, for example. So therefore, and it was discussed also in the European context, and whether there could be one standardized rate for whole Europe and so on. But I mean, the challenge from an international perspective is whether that kind of uniform discount rate or interest rate is really possible. So therefore, we see really the kind of urgency or the materiality of the issue. And so, yeah, these were the two projects we thought would be important. But I'm looking also at my table.
Yes, and we had a longer discussion about the necessity of operating segment reporting, and the comparability, if it would be necessary to implement some kind of management approach, and all the problems we see from the private sector. This was another huge topic. So we concluded, as the lady did before, that natural resources would maybe not be a very important topic for from the German perspective. So we take here a national perspective on the global questions. Those were the main issues I think we discussed on.
Okay, that's good. And I think that, that shows you the kind of challenge that we have as an international board in terms of, because as you say, there are some very specific challenges from a German perspective. And, actually, if you go to resource-rich countries, a number of countries in Africa, for example, Latin America, actually it's a really big issue. Or the first time I came across it actually was I did an event in Kazakhstan, and they said, why do you not have a standard on this issue? Was one of the kind of really big questions for them. So I think that, it shows you what we've got to try and do is actually come up with a balance in terms of moving things forward. And, on the differential reporting, even if we take that forward, actually, there might be a variety of different ways in which we take that, but ultimately it's going to be, at a jurisdiction level or maybe through IPSASB that actually that's operationalized. But I do think that, when you look across and the approach, you've got various different approaches, but quite often you do have that, that very big tail off in terms of size of entity and therefore what is appropriate. And much though I think the IPSASB handbook is a wonderful document, I wouldn't recommend it for a small village or anything like that. Thomas, you want to come in, and then I'll go to that table over there.
No, then go first to the table,
okay.
And I bring in the perspective at the end.
So if anybody wants to pick the mic up and just tell us a bit about your discussion.
I don't think we have much chat to the other tables, because I think there was a lot of kind of the same themes here as well, or the same sort of approaches. I think we also had a bit of a question mark about natural resources and how relevant it is. We also recognized that discount rate is a difficult topic, but also necessary topic, of course. And with the differential reporting, again, there was on the one hand, we also had sort of a bit of a German perspective here, that it's, I think, perhaps obvious that you cannot have the same standard for everybody. On the other hand, we're also thinking that sort of the big leap is in the minds of the people when they change to accrual, when sort of that is something which is kind of primary. Then perhaps how differentiated the standards are is maybe a bit, well, necessary, but secondary issue. So the first is to make that first jump from a cliff. But I guess that's it. If anybody wants to add?
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Thomas.
Yeah, just to give you a brief summary of the CAC discussion, probably two perspectives here. First discussion was really on the priority, is there a priority between theme A and theme B? And I think probably you described it already quite well. There is kind of a quite very heterogeneous perspective on this. there is the group of people also reflected in the CAG saying you should concentrate on public sector specific issues. This is why you are there for. And there is a kind of as strong advocacy for you should keep kind of convergence with IFRS and keep track with the work plan of IFRS, especially coming from Oceania, as you already mentioned. So that's number one, just to highlight that. I think everybody then in the end respected or kind of appreciated that we have a good situation not to decide on priority given the calm period, as you described it, of the ISB. And the recommendation was really to use this calm period and to focus on the public sector specific issues. So I think that was the discussion on that level. When it came to the specific projects, I think, and we had a similar discussion yesterday when we discussed the PSG strategy. Strategy is probably much more about deciding what you not do compared to what you do. And I think the first request when we had the first discussion in the CAG regarding the projects was to ask the board to more clearly describe how you applied the criteria you kind of showed us before, especially to the projects which you are not deciding to put on the work plan immediately, and why you decided to do that. And in that context, I think it's very helpful to have the Appendix A in the document now. I think that was really helpful for the CAG to understand what were the reasons not to do certain projects. I think when it comes to specific projects, just to mention a few, I think military assets, I think the CAG supported not having a full-blown project on that because obviously, and I think that reflected a little bit the discussion at the Global Public Sector Standards Setters Forum. It was perceived that we need application guidance, yes, but probably the principles are very much the same than in IPSAS 17 or IPSAS 31. So already there, but you need guidance how to apply them. In terms of discount rates, I think the CAG was very much in favor of having that, given that there is inconsistent and probably not clearly understandable guidance already in standards regarding defining the interest rate to come to a present value, especially of liabilities, long-term liabilities. So I think it was very much perceived as being necessary. Natural resources was brought up several times. I think especially from the African representatives, this project was very much supported. I think overall probably the CAG was supportive regarding that. When it comes to theme B, I think I'm looking a little bit in the direction of the German table. To call it like that, because obviously there was also a kind of a discussion, what is the reason that IPSAS 18 is not used? Is it because of the shape of the standard, or is it because of the lack of public sector needs for that, given that you already have a structure, a functional structure in the budget and a segmentation by function, which is given in the public sector much more than in the private sector, where you probably need this management perspective much more than in the public sector. Yeah, I think that's mainly it. So in general, I think supported the decision how it was made, yeah, that's it.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. I mean, the IPSAS 18 thing is quite interesting because, as you say, you have the codes of functions of government guidance out there, and I think it's one of those things where basically the standard is on a previous version of IFRS. It's not particularly well applied for the public sector context, and I think it's perhaps going back to Patrice's point earlier on. Actually, it's in our first very early run of standards, and I think now, with the benefit of hindsight, with the emphasis on GFS, and so on, actually it's something where we owe it to our constituents to actually produce some better guidance, not necessarily saying you need to use, but it's actually how you tie it together, how you use it in practice. And that might not actually be that difficult a project to actually do, but it would certainly be, would actually address something where the standard just isn't working at the moment. Okay, so Mark, anything you want to add?
Yes, yeah, just to add on this operating segments, if the way we should go at the end could also mean that we would end up in Team A with that project. So this was only to show that the Team A, I think the public sector specific issues really are likely to be the most important. And concerning the projects, it's from all these outreach activities, it's we can feel that there are stakeholders who have really issues they really want to have solved, and it seems to be the discount rates is an issue, the differential reporting, and also the natural resources in other continents. And I think that IPSASB will have to take account of the strongest needs, which don't necessarily need to be an issue for all the stakeholders, but I think this will guide us a little and bit. And I think from the first impression I have is that it's rather supported, but of course we will see it, what you'll be writing into the answer sheets.
Yeah, exactly. And what we will do is take those in at the end of the afternoon. Accountancy Europe staff, we've agreed they'll scan them in, so we've got them available immediately, which will be very useful. So on that theme, if you can now make sure that you've completed the voting sheets in terms of those two questions, the one on specific matter for comment 4 and the one on specific matter for comment 5. When you've done that, then there's some lunch outside, and not before. So minutes for lunch, and then we'll start again this afternoon. But thanks very much, everyone, for this morning. I think it's been really good discussion, and I'm looking forward to the discussions this afternoon. So forms, and then enjoy your lunch. Thanks.
It's good that we